Pare com isso! Ameaças! Um sensamo que está causando um aquecimento global vão ser precisos também! Todos nós vamos morrer por causa de uma coisa dessas! Ameaças! Para de filmar isso! Desliga esse aquecedor, eu já disse! Que tá quente pra caramba! Tá quente sim! Para com isso! Para de filmar isso, ameaça! Ameaças! Ameaças! Eu já disse pra você que está aquecendo! Eu já disse que está tudo aquecendo! Preste atenção! Não, isso aqui não preste atenção nisso aqui não! Para com isso!
Hoje, às 5 horas da tarde, eu vou colocar aqui no canal um vídeo com o professor Ricardo Felício refutando ponto a ponto do que o Pirula disse. Porque é impressionante. O Pirula não consegue ler os próprios gráficos, o que faz com que você fique realmente preocupado com a qualidade da formação nas nossas universidades. São 6 horas que o Pirula dedica a tentar refutar o professor Ricardo Felício. E nessas 6 horas ele não consegue apresentar prova nenhuma de que é o homem que aquece o planeta. O Ricardo Felício, ao contrário, apresenta as provas de que não só não é o homem que aquece o planeta, como é impossível isso acontecer. Mas você não precisa acreditar em mim, você não precisa acreditar no professor Ricardo Felício, basta que você entenda como ler os gráficos. E para te ajudar a fazer isso, eu vou colocar aqui 4 vídeos. O primeiro deles é com Richard Lindzen, que tem mais de 200 artigos publicados nas mais conceituadas revistas de ciência. É matemático e físico atmosférico, formado por Harvard, PhD por Harvard, tá? Tem 30 anos como professor do MIT e recebeu o título de Distinguished Senior Fellow pela Center for the Study of Science, que pouquíssimas pessoas que têm isso. Ele vai te explicar como são esses gráficos. Depois eu vou colocar aqui um vídeo do Bjorn Lomborg, para que você saiba quanto que você vai gastar com essa brincadeira de aquecimento global, que é uma farsa. Quanto você vai pagar, quanto vai sair do seu bolso, tá? Ele é PhD, professor da Universidade de Copenhague, foi diretor do Instituto de Avaliação Ambiental e é presidente do Centro de Consenso. E aí você fala, nossa, mas falta um ambientalista. Não tem problema, eu vou colocar aqui um vídeo também do Patrick Moura, que simplesmente fundou o Greenpeace. Esses vídeos foram traduzidos pelos tradutores da direita, tá? E vão estar aqui no final dessa minha pequena introdução. E mais importante, eu vou colocar um vídeo também a respeito do Climagate. Porque aqui no Brasil não chega nenhuma dessas notícias. Mas esse é o maior escândalo de como eles fraudaram os dados de computador, de como eles fizeram toda essa putaria, e nos Estados Unidos todo mundo sabe. E é por isso que o Trump revogou o Acordo de Paris. Tá entendendo? Então preste muita atenção, porque esse conhecimento você vai levar para o resto da sua vida aqui, tá? E fique atento, 5 horas da tarde o professor Ricardo Felício faz a refutação ponto a ponto. Foi difícil convencer o professor Ricardo Felício, tá? Ele fez o vídeo aqui muito sem voz, tá? Porque ele tinha acabado de fazer uma palestra. Ele falou, não, cara, a baixeza, né, as distorções e as mentiras do Pirula eu vou discutir com ele em uma outra esfera. E eu espero que o professor Ricardo Felício processe o Pirula por causa disso. Agora, aí o Ricardo Felício falou assim, você precisa fazer, as pessoas precisam saber. Tá? Mas ele falou assim, eu não vou responder o Pirula. Todo estudante de climatologia acha ridículo essa exposição dele. É absurdo, o cara está confundindo clima com temperatura, é ridículo. Eu falei, mas as pessoas precisam saber. Então convenci ele a gravar esse vídeo. E o mais interessante é que, depois do Pirula ter feito todo esse negócio, né, ele começa, são 6 horas tentando refutar, começa com, vou manter na sua cara, Felício, você é um nojento, escroto, não dá porrada. Depois ele começa suavizando os argumentos. Felício, olha aqui, Felício, olha aqui, Felício. Mas toda a turma do Pirula começa a entrar nessa daqui também. Né? Maestro Boquete, e depois tem o canal do Otário. Esse canal do Otário é maravilhoso, né? Então vocês vejam aqui, ele é claro, a favor do aborto, Diz que o Bolsonaro e o Jean Willis é a mesma coisa, os dois são extremistas. Faz um vídeo onde o Jean Willis está enrabando o Bolsonaro, que é fã do Tico Santa Cruz, tá aqui a foto do editor dele com o Tico Santa Cruz, dizendo, vocalista de atitude, que se posiciona contra os atuais acontecimentos políticos e altamente engajado com suas próprias convicções, algo extremamente raro para músicos brasileiros que geralmente são alienados, digo, prudente. E é claro, é da turma do merda, como vocês podem ver aí, né? A entrevista com o maestro Boquete. Todos eles são bem amiguinhos, todos eles são bem juntinhos. E aí eu vou ter o quê? Eu vou ter a amizade com esses caras, precisa unir a direita, mas que coisa maravilhosa. Então todo o deboche, né, com o professor Ricardo Felício tentando dizer que ser cético a respeito do aquecimento global causado pelo homem, que é impossível, é como se você estivesse defendendo a Terra plana, Adão e Eva e tudo mais. Esses caras sempre tentam distorcer tudo. E aí eu coloquei uma foto no meu perfil, né, queimando tudo até que chegue o aquecimento global. E aí o canal do otário retweetou, dizendo o seguinte: aquecimento global não existe, ainda bem que animais como este não reproduzem. Que graça, ainda coloca uma carinha piscante aqui no final. Ainda bem que animais como esse não reproduzem, você sabe. Eu perdi o meu filho durante a gestação e para a turma do Pirula isso é muito engraçado, isso é muito legal. Né? Mas é claro, eu sou um mentiroso, Na realidade, estamos falando aqui do Alexandre Frota, do Vinícius de Moraes e de um inscrito do canal. Não existem referências a ninguém, é claro que não. Pois muito bem, às 5 horas da tarde, você vai ver o professor Ricardo Felício refutando ponto a ponto. E se você quer continuar sendo um otário, um paspalho, o problema é seu, colega. O problema é seu. Agora, a lição dos professores.
I'm an atmospheric physicist. I've published more than 200 scientific papers. For 30 years, I taught at MIT, during which time the climate has changed remarkably little. But the cry of global warming has grown ever more shrill. In fact, it seems that the less the climate changes, the louder the voices of the climate alarmists get. So let's clear the air and create a more accurate picture of where we really stand on the issue of global warming, or, as it is now called, climate change. There are basically 3 groups of people dealing with this issue. Groups 1 and 2 are scientists. Group 3 consists mostly at its core of politicians, environmentalists, and media. Group 1 is associated with the scientific part of the United Nations International Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC Working Group 1. These are scientists who mostly believe that recent climate change is primarily due to man's burning of fossil fuels, oil, coal, and natural gas. This releases CO2, carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere, and they believe this might eventually dangerously heat the planet. Group 2 is made up of scientists who don't see this as an especially serious problem. It's the group I belong to. We're usually referred to as skeptics. We note that there are many reasons why the climate changes: the sun, clouds, oceans, the orbital variations of the Earth, as well as a myriad of other inputs. None of these is fully understood, and there is no evidence that CO2 emissions are the dominant factor. But actually, there is much agreement between both groups of scientists. The following are such points of agreement. 1. The climate is always changing. 2. CO2 is a greenhouse gas without which life on Earth is not possible, but adding it to the atmosphere should lead to some warming. 3. Atmospheric levels of CO2 have been increasing since the end of the Little Ice Age. in the 19th century. 4. Over this period, past 2 centuries, the global mean temperature has increased slightly and erratically by about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit or 1 degree Celsius. But only since the 1960s have man's greenhouse emissions been sufficient to play a role. 5. Given the complexity of climate, no confident prediction about future global mean temperature or its impact can be made. The IPCC acknowledged in its own 2007 report that, quote, the long-term prediction of future climate states is not possible, end quote. Most importantly, the scenario that the burning of fossil fuels leads to catastrophe isn't part of what either group asserts. So why are so many people worried, indeed panic-stricken, about this issue? Here's where Group 3 comes in: the politicians, environmentalists, and media. Global warming alarmism provides them, more than any other issue, with the things they most want. For politicians, it's money and power. For environmentalists, it's money for their organizations and confirmation of their near religious devotion to the idea that man is a destructive force acting upon nature. And for the media, it's ideology, money, and headlines. Doomsday scenarios sell. Meanwhile, over the last decade, scientists outside of climate physics have jumped on the bandwagon, publishing papers blaming global warming for everything from acne to the Syrian civil war. And crony capitalists have eagerly grabbed for the subsidies that governments have so lavishly provided. Unfortunately, Group 3 is winning the argument because they have drowned out the serious debate that should be going on. But while politicians, environmentalists, and media types can waste a lot of money and scare a lot of people, they won't be able to bury the truth. The climate will have the final word on that. I'm Richard Lindzen, Emeritus Professor of Atmospheric Sciences at MIT for Prager University.
To subscribe to our YouTube channel, click here. To help keep our videos free, donate here.
Much has been made of the Paris Climate Agreement signed by the leaders of 178 countries in 2016. French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius, speaking for many, called it a historic turning point. The head of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Gina McCarthy, echoed the minister's remark when she testified before the House Committee on Science, Space and Technology. The Paris Agreement was, she said, an incredible achievement. But when pressed by committee members to explain exactly how much this treaty would reduce global temperatures, she would not, or could not, say. This combination of grand pronouncements and vague specifics is a good strategy for Paris Agreement fans to take, because the agreement will cost a fortune but do little to reduce global warming. Consider the Obama administration's signature climate policy, the Clean Power Plan. Using the same climate prediction model that the UN uses, I found that the power plan will accomplish almost nothing. Even if its cuts to carbon dioxide emissions are fully implemented, not just for the 14 years that the Paris Agreement lasts, but for the rest of the century, the Clean Power Plan would reduce the temperature increase in 2100 by just 0.023 degrees Fahrenheit. The President has made further and grander promises of future U.S. carbon cuts, but these are only vaguely outlined. In the unlikely event that all of these extra cuts also happen and are adhered to throughout the rest of the century, the combined reduction in temperatures would be 0.057 degrees. To put it another way, if the U.S. delivers for the whole century on the President's very ambitious rhetoric, it would postpone global warming by about 8 months at the end of the century. Now, let's add in the rest of the world's Paris promises. If we generously assume that the promised carbon cuts for 2030 are not only met, which itself would be a UN first, but sustained throughout the rest of the century, temperatures in 2100 would drop by 0.3 degrees, the equivalent of postponing warming by less than 4 years. Again, that's using the UN's own climate prediction model. But here's the biggest problem. These minuscule benefits do not come free. Quite the contrary. The cost of the Paris Climate Pact is likely to run to $1 to $2 trillion every year, based on estimates produced by the Stanford Energy Modeling Forum and the Asia Modeling Exercise. In other words, we will spend at least $100 trillion in order to reduce the temperature by the end of the century by a grand total of 0.3 degree. Some Paris Agreement supporters defend it by claiming that its real impact on temperatures will be much more significant than the UN model predicts. But this requires mental gymnastics and heroic assumptions. The Climate Action Tracker, widely cited by Paris Agreement fans, predict a temperature reduction of 1.6 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. But this prediction is based very heavily on the assumption that even stronger climate policies will be adopted in the future. Actually, 98% of the assumed reductions will come only after 2030, which is what the current Paris Agreement covers. And even such wishful thinking won't achieve anything close to the 2 degrees Celsius reduction that has become the somewhat arbitrary but widely adopted benchmark to avoid the worst effects of global warming. The actual promised emission reductions under the Paris Agreement literally gets us just 1% of the way to the 2 degrees target. 99% of what would be required is put off until after 2030. The Paris Agreement is the wrong solution to a real problem. The right solution will most likely be found through green energy research and development, like that promoted by Bill Gates and the Breakthrough Coalition. Mr. Gates has announced that private investors are committing $7 billion for clean energy R&D. Instead of political hot air and ever larger government subsidies of today's inefficient green technologies, those who want to combat climate change should focus on dramatically boosting green energy innovation. The US already shows the way. With its pursuit of fracking, making it safer and more efficient every year, America has drastically reduced the cost of natural gas. This momentous switch from coal to lower CO2 gas as a source of energy has done far more to drive down carbon dioxide emissions than any recent government climate policy. Turns out that those politicians who gathered in Paris, France, could learn a lot from Paris, Texas. I'm Bjorn Lomborg, president of the Copenhagen Consensus Center.
To subscribe to our YouTube channel, click here. To help keep our videos free, donate here.
The only constant is change. That's true about life, and it's true about the climate. The climate has been constantly changing since the Earth was formed 4.6 billion years ago. For example, in just the past 2,000 years, we have seen the Roman warm period, when it was warmer than today. Then came the cooler Dark Ages, followed by the medieval warm period, when it was at least as warm as today. Then we had the Little Ice Age that drove the Vikings out of Greenland, and most recently, a gradual 300-year warming to the present day. That's a lot of changes, and of course, not one of them was caused by humans. During the past 400,000 years, there have been 4 major periods of glaciation, meaning that vast sheets of ice covered a good part of the globe, interrupted by brief interglacial periods. We are in one of those periods right now. This is all part of the Pleistocene Ice Age, which began in earnest 2.5 million years ago. It's still going on, which means that we are still living in an ice age. That's the reason there's so much ice at the poles. 30 million years ago, the Earth had no ice on it at all. So then what about carbon dioxide, the great villain of the global warming alarmists? Where does that fit into this picture? Not as neatly as you might think. temperatures and carbon dioxide levels do not show a strong correlation. In fact, over very long time spans, periods of hundreds of millions of years, they are often completely out of sync with one another. Over and over again, within virtually any time frame, we find the climate changing, for reasons we do not fully understand. But we do know there are many more factors in play than simply the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. Factors such as the shape and size of the Earth's elliptical orbit around the Sun, activity from the Sun, and the amount of wobble or tilt in the Earth's axis, among many others. Even the relatively short 300-year period from the peak of the Little Ice Age to the present has not been steady. The latest trend has been a warming one, but it began nearly a century before there were significant carbon dioxide emissions from burning fossil fuels. And there has been no significant warming trend in the 21st century. Contrary to media headlines, the trend over the past couple of decades has been essentially flat. Meanwhile, human-caused CO2 emissions are higher than ever. About 25% of all the CO2 emissions from human sources have occurred during this period of no net warming. So what are we in for next? Will the temperature resume an upward trend? Will it remain flat for a lengthy period? Or will it begin to drop? No one knows, not even the biggest, fastest computers. All the information I've presented, the increases, decreases, and plateaus in temperature over the ages and into the last centuries, is available to anyone who wants to seek it out. Yet to state these simple facts is to risk being called a climate change denier. Not only is that absurd, it's mean-spirited. It's absurd because no one, not even the most fervent skeptic, denies that the climate is changing. And it's mean-spirited because to call someone a climate change denier is to intentionally link them to people who deny the Holocaust. So maybe it's time to stop the name-calling. Predicting the climate, one of the most complex systems on Earth, with thousands of inputs, many of which we don't understand, isn't an exact science or anything close to it. Maybe it's just a tad arrogant to suggest that we can predict the weather or the climate or just about anything 60 years from now. The science is not settled. The debate is not over. The climate is always changing, it always has, and it always will. I'm Patrick Moore, co-founder of Greenpeace for Prager University.
Join Prager University. Click here to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click here to sign up for free at prageru.com for quizzes, contests, and prizes.
This is James Corbett of ClimateGate.tv, and this week marks the one-year anniversary of the release of emails and documents from the Climatic Research Unit at the University of East Anglia that we now know as ClimateGate. Sitting here now, 1 year later, it's becoming difficult to remember the importance of that release of information, or even what information was actually released. Many were only introduced to the scandal through commentary in the blogosphere, and many more came to know about it only weeks later, after the establishment media had a chance to assess the damage and fine-tune the spin that would help allay their audience's concern that something important had just happened. Very few have actually bothered to read the emails and documents for themselves. Few have browsed the hairy README file, the electronic notes of a harried programmer trying to make sense of the CRU's databases. They have never read for themselves how temperatures in the database were artificially adjusted to look closer to the real temperatures. Or the hundreds, if not thousands, of dummy stations which somehow ended up in the database. Or how the exasperated programmer resorts to expletives before admitting he made up key data on weather stations because it was impossible to tell what data was coming from what sources. Few have read the 2005 email from ClimateGate ringleader and CRU head Phil Jones to John Christie, where he states, quote, "The scientific community would come down on me in no uncertain terms if I said the world had cooled from 1998. Okay, it has, but it is only 7 years of data and it isn't statistically significant." Or where he concludes, "As you know, I'm not political. If anything, I would like to see the climate change happen so the science could be proved right, regardless of the consequences. This isn't being political, it is being selfish. Or the email where he broke the law by asking Michael Mann of hockey stick fame to delete a series of emails related to a Freedom of Information request he had just received. Or the email where he wrote, "If they ever hear there is a Freedom of Information Act now in the UK, I think I'll delete the file rather than send it to anyone. We also have a Data Protection Act, which I will hide behind." Or the other emails where these men of science say they will redefine the definition of peer review in order to keep differing viewpoints out of the scientific literature. Or where they discuss ousting a suspected skeptic from his editorial position in a key scientific journal. Or where they fret about how to hide the divergence in temperature proxy records from observed temperatures. Or where they openly discuss the complete lack of warming over the last decade. Or any of the thousands of other emails and documents exposing a laundry list of gross scientific and academic abuses. Of course, the alarmists continue to argue, as they have ever since they first began to acknowledge the scandal, that ClimateGate is insignificant. Without addressing any of the issues or the specific emails, they simply point to the independent investigations that they say have vindicated the ClimateGate scientists. Like the UK Parliamentary Committee, which issued a report claiming that Phil Jones and the CRU's scientific credibility remained intact after a rigorous one-day hearing which featured no testimony from any skeptic or dissenting voice. After the release of the report, the committee stressed that the report did not address all of the issues raised by ClimateGate, and Phil Willis, the committee chairman, admitted that the committee had rushed to put out a report before the British election. Or the Oxburgh Inquiry, chaired by Lord Ron Oxburgh, the UK Vice Chair of Globe International, an NGO-funded climate change legislation lobby group. The Oxburgh Inquiry released a 5-page report after having reviewed 11 scientific papers unrelated to the ClimateGate scandal that had been handpicked by Phil Jones himself. It heard no testimony or evidence from anyone critical of the CRU. Unsurprisingly, it found the ClimateGaters not guilty of academic misconduct. Regardless of what one thinks of the veracity or independence of these so-called investigations into the ClimateGate scandal itself, what has followed has been a catastrophic meltdown of the supposedly united front of scientific opinion that man-made CO2 is causing catastrophic global warming. In late November of 2009, just days after the initial release of the ClimateGate emails, the University of East Anglia was in the hot seat again. The CRU was forced to admit that they had thrown away most of the raw data that their global temperature calculations were based upon, meaning their work was not reproducible by any outside scientists. In December of that year, the UN's Copenhagen climate talks broke down when a negotiating document was leaked showing that, contrary to all PR, it would be the third world nations bearing the brunt of a new international climate treaty, with punishing restrictions on carbon emissions that would prevent them from ever industrializing. The document, written by industrialized nations, allowed the first world to emit twice as much carbon per person as the third world, and was widely seen as an implementation of a eugenical austerity program under a green cover. This agenda was further exposed by the influential Optimum Population Trust in the UK, which began arguing that same month that rich Westerners offset their carbon footprints by funding programs to stop black people from breeding. In January 2010, it was revealed that a passing comment to a journalist from an Indian climatologist that the Himalayan glaciers could melt within 40 years found its way into the much-touted Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's fourth report on climate change via a World Wildlife Fund fundraising pamphlet. When IPCC defenders tried to pass the universally derided prediction off as a legitimate mistake, the coordinating lead author of that section of the report admitted that the IPCC knew that the report was based on baseless speculation in a non-peer-reviewed work, but deliberately included it because we thought that if we can highlight it, it will impact policymakers and politicians and encourage them to take some concrete action. Later that month, doubt was cast on another claim in the IPCC report, this one that 40% of the Amazon rainforest was in danger of disappearing due to man-made global warming. These doubts were confirmed in July, when the claim was sourced back to pure, unverified speculation on the now-defunct website of a Brazilian environmental advocacy group. Just this month, the exact opposite of the original claim was shown to be the case when a new study appeared in Science, demonstrating that forests in past warming periods were not decimated, but in fact blooming with life, experiencing a rapid and distinct increase in plant diversity and origination rates. Also in January, the UK Information Commissioner ruled that researchers at the CRU had broken the law by refusing to comply with Freedom of Information requests, but that no criminal prosecution would follow because of a statute of limitations on prosecuting the illegal activity. In February, the UK Guardian revealed that a key study co-authored by Phil Jones that purported to show there was no such thing as the well-established urban heat island effect was found to have relied on seriously flawed data. This, according to The Guardian, led to apparent attempts to cover up problems with the temperature data. In September, John Holdren, the man who had previously advocated adding sterilizing agents to the water supply to combat the overpopulation problem, which he thought would ravage the Earth by the year 2000, and who currently is the science czar in the Obama White House, advocated a name change for global warming to climate disruption, further affirming the theory's non-scientific status as an unfalsifiable prediction that anything that ever happens is due to man-made carbon dioxide. Later that month, Britain's prestigious Royal Society rewrote its climate change summary to admit that the science was infused with uncertainties and that it is not possible to determine exactly how much the Earth will warm or exactly how the climate will change in the future. In October, a carbon reduction advocacy group called 1010 released a video to promote its campaign in which those skeptical about participating in the program are literally blown up. And just this month, Scientific American, a publication that has been noted for publishing increasingly alarmist reports about the reality and the dangers of man-made CO2-induced global warming, conducted a poll of its own readers that found over 77% believe natural processes to be the cause of climate change, and almost 80% responded that they would not be willing to pay a single penny on schemes to forestall the supposed effects of supposedly man-made global warming that even ClimateGate scientist Phil Jones now admits is no longer taking place. And this is only the briefest of overviews of the range of information that ClimateGate.tv has been tracking over the past year. These reports undermine the data, the sources, the scientific processes, and the conclusions of the scientists who continue to argue that carbon dioxide is driving climate change and that that change is catastrophic and unprecedented. The reports show that the main temperature records that are used to determine the highly problematic concept of the global mean temperature are in fact in the hands of scientists like Phil Jones and James Hansen with a direct stake in the continuation of the alarmist scare. When these scientists are questioned on the sources of their data, they advocate deleting emails and even deleting data itself. They admit the key data underlying their calculations has already been deleted. And yet, with all of this, they have the audacity to continue to suggest that there is overwhelming consensus on the science of global warming. They call for public debates with skeptics who they invariably accuse of being funded by big oil, and then, when they are actually organized, they back out of those debates. They then continue to call for the imprisonment of anyone who dares to question this supposedly ironclad science. And now, they are preparing to meet once again. Next month, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change will descend on Cancun, Mexico, to once again try to hammer out a globally binding agreement on the restriction of carbon emissions. They will once again act as if carbon dioxide is a vile poison and not one of the essential ingredients of life on this planet. They will once again pretend that a causal link between carbon dioxide and catastrophic or unprecedented warming has been established. They will once again pretend that inflicting severe austerity on the third world in the name of greening the earth is anything other than eugenics by another name. They will once again pretend that the consolidation of powers of global taxation in an unelected authority is a scientific necessity and not a political scheme. This year, though, there will be a difference. The public at large is another year older, another year wiser, and less prepared than ever to accept unquestioned the dire assertions of grandstanding politicians and the scientists they fund that the world is on the brink of imminent destruction. When they say the science is certain and settled, we will know better. When they say that this is humanity's last chance, we will see them for the chicken littles they have always been. This is not a call for complacency. In fact, now that the public is more skeptical than ever about the climate gators and others of their ilk, the danger of binding international agreements enacted by unelected institutions and empowering global taxation is at an all-time high. They are hoping to ram through an agreement that will put the final nail in the coffin of climate realism before the corpse of the global warming hoax even has the chance to rot. We have to speak out against this fraud now and more loudly than ever. We must make our voices heard when we assert that science is about honesty, openness, the search for truth, and that those who reject those principles will no longer be heeded by a public that has been stretched long past the point of credulity. Once again, the UN-funded scientists and politicians are telling us that the hour is nigh, and perhaps for once they are right. The end is almost here for those who are trying to establish their global governance in the name of scientific fraud. If we can continue to speak out on this issue, perhaps there will be no UNFCCC conference next year after all. For if ClimateGate has taught us anything, it is that just 1 year can make all the difference. For ClimateGate.tv in Western Japan, I am James Corbett.